Hello and welcome to Share.Care's What is Manly radio show and podcast. Men feel more lonely, lost, and not useful in society than ever in history. Males are not attaching to school, work, or women. What it means to be a man appears lost. Is there a framework for being manly that we can unearth?
Welcome to Share.Care, an all-inclusive community sharing experience, strength, and hope to create strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships. Share.Care communities work toward every individual feeling safe, valued, and heard, free from the threat of danger, pain, or harm. Each episode, founder Damian Andrews explores the principles underpinning Share.Care and invites expert special guests to share their knowledge so you can easily reap the benefits so many others experience. You hold the choice to create your future. Let it be with strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships.
Hello, Bill. How are you?
I am great, Damien. How are you?
I'm well here, and again, we're loving the inspired by COVID, this ability to talk to people around the world and it feel normal. It used to be, if you're having an online meeting, it was kind of the odd thing to do, but now it's pretty standard. So it's wonderful to meet people like yourself on the other part of the world. And you were just saying in the pre-show that although you're you've got a background that looks like you're in somewhere where snow, you're actually in Florida. So that gives a whole new dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. It's more virtual than it seems, I guess.
Yeah, but it's still about that human connection that we're able to have. We're able to have these deep discussions. And for the audience, just so you know who you're talking to, we're talking with William Adam, and he has a BA in psychology. He's a certified hypnotist and has an advanced certificate in neuro-optimal brain training. And he's also the author of Confessions of a Sensitive Man and On Being a Sensitive Man. So there's a lot to do with the topic that from a psychological perspective and from that sensitivity side that I think people want from men, but how do we express that? It seems like you've done a lot of work in that. So do you want to start from a broader perspective, because there's a lot of talk out there that some men are feeling lonely, they're lost, they're not feeling useful in society. What have you witnessed, and what do you notice that's happening in that regard?
I think honestly, and let me really quickly, I say it's William Allen's, it's not Adams. So I just want to make sure.
Apologies.
No worries. They're very close and understandable completely.
No, I've got Allen written on my notes, and I think I was having one of those. I've never been tested positive for ADD, but maybe I've got it.
That's quite all right. So yeah, I really do think that what's happening is that we're sort of having a kind of a crisis, especially amongst men, about what role we have nowadays, and what does it really mean to be masculine? What does it mean to be a man anymore? A lot of men, I think, feel like there's a lot of criticism of men and traditional masculinity, which I think is deserved, but it's something that I think it leaves most men wondering, okay, what am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to be? And one of the things that I found in writing the books on high sensitivity, which we'll get into in a minute, is that a lot of highly sensitive men feel and have felt this kind of internal crisis about masculinity and measuring up. And you were talking earlier about the sort of the stereotypical models from traditional masculinity: Clint Eastwood, John Wayne, Arnold Schwarzenegger, these hyper masculine men, which make great movie heroes, but they're really not realistic characters for living in the 21st century in a modern world. So I think there is kind of a crisis that a lot of men are experiencing in trying to define themselves as men. Who are we? What are we supposed to be? What is the expectation? And can I be just who I am and still be a man and still be considered masculine. So these are the kind of things that, and in my conversations, especially with other men, and by the way, I'm working on a book right now on masculinity because it was such an intriguing topic to me that I felt like I needed to do some more research on the history of masculinity and how it's shaped and formed, culture and civilization over the last 10,000 years. And it has been eye-opening. And I think it's a topic that a lot of men, if they're not openly talking about it, they're talking about it under their breaths.
That's an interesting point that you made there, that if they're not openly talking about it, they're talking about it under their breath. And I would add to that I don't think it's just men having that conversation. It'd be women as well. There seems to be almost like a hijacked narrative where it's this extreme thing. But in talking with a lot of people, there's a lot of diverse opinion on what is masculinity, and it's not just one thing where all right, all of a sudden men are this horrible misogynistic assholes. A lot of men are really, from what I'm gathering, a lot of men, well, they, from my experience, a lot of men are really nice, and a lot of women recognize that they're really nice. Is that fair to say as well, that it might be something that's been hijacked a lot as well?
Oh, I'm sure it has been. Again, I think the crisis is probably with, if you think of masculine, just about like everything that we measure human behavior on is probably on some kind of a spectrum. You have you have men that are sort of hyper masculine. You have men that may be, by that traditional definition of masculinity, a little bit more effeminate or feminine in the way they conduct themselves and so forth. I don't like using that polarity. That's my personal opinion, because a lot of the things that we bucket as masculine and things that we bucket as feminine are simply human behaviors that somewhere along the way somebody decided, culturally or whatever, that this is going to be the thing that men do and this is going to be the thing that women do, even though both men and women are capable of these kind of behaviors and these kind of emotions and feelings and so forth. And we become enslaved to that traditional masculinity, which for the most part, drums out the same message, which is men are supposed to be stoic and warrior-like and aggressive and dominant, and they're supposed to not show emotion. They're not supposed to show feelings, and there's no vulnerability there. And it makes men very isolated, because what that does, it says, you've got to handle everything by yourself. You get help from anybody. And we see this all over and over again in the fact that men have more health issues than women do. They don't live as long as women do. And there's a higher rate of male suicides. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that men are not allowed to ask for help. They're taught not to ask for help. And they live their lives in this sort of lonely desperation state because they can't be fully human. And that is being able to express themselves. And as I was saying, as I'm doing this research on masculinity, that seems to be a recurring theme, from sociologists to anthropologists to psychologists and whatever. Everybody is coming up with that same idea, that it's locking men into this sort of box they can't move around in.
That's an interesting point that you raised there about, they're locked into that, and there's this social norm is the right word, where there's this frame of masculinity. And the reason I'm raising that is because, from my experience, I found that definition quite difficult to comprehend. And I put that in the framework was I ended up being posted to the SASR in Australia, which is Australia's special forces, the best of the best in the military. And there was a lot of, obviously they were trained to do what they were trained to do. And there was, all the men there that I knew were very able to ask for help when they needed help. When they had an issue, an emotional issue they needed to do, they were able to ask, because you can't perform at that level unless you deal with these things. And I think if you take elite athletes or elite anybody in their field, if they don't get help when they need help, they're not going to continue to perform there. So I always found it a really difficult when you've got these role models in the, say, film and television that you rattled off before, and I loved Clint Eastwood as a kid. It was, I enjoyed Clint Eastwood movies, and then when you say, okay, we can't, men are not supposed to have that, but is that just a snapshot when we look at that role model and we go in a movie? That's just a snapshot of part of what they need to be. Because I look at the guys I was in the army with, they could be really tough when they needed to be. In that moment, if you're in a fight and it's for your survival, being stoic is pretty good. It's not like someone, stabs your finger and you go, oh, my finger hurts, stop. It's like you've got to keep going. So in that moment, they needed to be stoic and move forward. But then outside of that moment, they were in touch with the other side. And is that kind of balance that we need to have, is going, okay, there's certain moments where you need to do this. There's other moments where you need to have that sensitive. You need to be asked those questions.
Yeah, that's precisely what we should be able to do.
Yeah.
I think what I'm referring to is the studies that have looked at men generally across the board. Now, there may be some criteria that in selection to those special forces that you were in that may look at psychological well-being and that kind of thing, and well-adjusted individuals. But a lot of people aren't like that. A lot of men aren't like that. And I agree with you. I mean, if you're a soldier and you're fighting, you need to be focused on what you're doing. You need to be almost unemotional and almost robotic in order to execute something the way it's supposed to be done. But that's in a special area that hopefully doesn't get we're not in wars all the time. We have to act this way.
Yeah.
The problem is that we internalize that kind of thing and say, well, that's the way we should be all the time. That's the way we should be all the time. And that's not realistic for a lot of men. You got to understand something. In special forces, I would imagine, just like the Navy SEALs here are in the U.S. or the Green Berets, there is a selection process that they go through, and they qualify these people on a lot of criteria, including psychological profiles. They don't want people to be erratic. As you said, out in the field, you can't have that when your buddy is freaking out and you're in the middle of a fight.
Yeah.
But overall, the whole population of men, I think there are a lot of men, individuals that were raised within this culture that they're supposed to be a certain way.
Yeah.
Some men can't do that, right? And the point I'm making is that we shouldn't all be shoehorned into one single description of what men should be.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be broadened, and we need to take into account of the fact that we have as many individual men as there are individual people on the planet, and their genetic makeup, their personality structure, all that kind of stuff is unique. And we should allow people, especially men, because, like I said, I think that's really where a lot of the crisis is, to be who they are. Not everybody is going to be a special ops person. Yeah, you're going to need people to do other things as well in the world. And I think as a whole, you want to take into account the fact that one size really doesn't fit all.
Yeah. No, I love what you said there, and I hadn't really processed that fully, but you're right, because when I went there, that was one of the key things. You had to go through a whole psychological process before you even got there. So I hadn't really thought through that, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I hadn't thought through that process where they're actually looking for people that they must have been. I'm going to do some more research on that, where they're looking for people that were able to, deal with those emotions, because there are high stressful situations, which is why I wanted to bring that up, because as you say, the mainstream, what they get is that snapshot, this Clint Eastwood, Arnold Schwarzenegger in that moment where, in a moment, if there's a house on fire, you want to have, ideally it'd be nice to have the courage to just go in and rescue someone if they need to be rescued, to be able to muster that up. That would be a nice thing to be able to do. But you don't want to, you don't need to have that every day in life, because there isn't houses on fire every day. Right. And that's where I want to come back to. So I'm just wondering, have we lost that little bit of communication where we've got, one snapshot that's in a movie going, oh, this is that part of being masculine, but the other part, the sensitive part, the part where, you know, your partner comes up to you and she wants a cuddle and you wrap your arms around her and just hold her close, and she wants to have a bit of a discussion about what's going on for you, and you're able to open up and say, hey, this is the problem I'm having, or I need this help. We're missing that part of the conversation. Is that where we're at?
Well, I think that's very true. A lot of times, now, again, as we talk about this, we're going to be talking a lot of generalizations, because there obviously are differences in how people perceive themselves, men particularly, perceive themselves as being masculine. There are a lot of men who are very comfortable being in that sort of traditional role, and it seems to suit them, right?
Yeah.
But there are a lot of men who feel, well, you know, that's uncomfortable for me because I am maybe a little bit more emotional, or I like to be able to express myself more emotionally and show some vulnerability from time to time. You know, I find it kind of a joke that, you know, the thing that men, and I'm guilty of this as much as anyone, is asking a female for directions for anything, right? I figure I'm going to figure it out on my own. But the ironic thing about this is, if you notice, most GPS systems they put in cars and on phones and everything else are female voices. So it's almost like a slap in the face to men to say, I've got to ask this GPS, and it comes back with a female voice telling me how to drive my car this way or that way. But I think for a lot of men, it's allowing them to be vulnerable when they need to be. It doesn't mean falling apart. It doesn't mean always being vulnerable. And being emotional means being able to express fully the full palette of human emotions that are out there. And now, I grew up, Damien, in a very conservative part of the United States, in the southeast, of southern part of the United States, where men were men and women were women, and blah, blah, blah. And it was a very traditional way of looking at masculinity. And that's how I grew up, with kind of indoctrination. My dad was Southern, my mother was Southern. So I kind of got that reinforced from childhood. This is what a boy is supposed to be. This is what a man is supposed to be. And whatever you do, don't be like a girl. Don't be like a female. Don't be, and again, it goes back to those buckets we put into, this is a female thing, it's a male thing. So what happens is, emotions and feelings and things that every normal human boy experiences start getting suppressed when they're 2, 3, 4 years old. They're told, you know, you got to be a man here. You need to be a man. You need to act like a man. And it goes against what nature has built into us, these emotions and feelings and so forth. Now, I'm not advocating that we have a bunch of people screaming around, you know, with wild emotions all over the place. There is such a thing as emotional regulation, and I'm definitely for that, right? I think most people would be. But the idea of suppressing emotions is a toxic thing to do, right?
Definitely,
This is the thing that causes so many health issues with men, is not being able to, when they need to be vulnerable, to be able to do that. It's just simple health physiology that goes along with the human body. So there are things about this traditional model of masculinity that I really think we need to take a look at and say, is this really the model we want to use going forward in the 21st century?
Now, that's a good point that you raised. This whole, I mean, we need, if we've got a problem, I mean, it can be, we're community creatures. We always have been, and now it seems to, like, if you go back through history, I mean, not recent history, but long-term history, we operated as a community, and people worked together to resolve things. It only seems in more modern times that we've shifted to this thing where the men can't ask for help or can't say what's going on. I was talking to someone earlier about how, you know, there would be a group where you would have your elders, and if there was a problem, if a younger man had a problem, he would talk to the elder about that and get advice, and they respected the elders from that perspective. The elders didn't say, piss off and go and work it out for yourself, you're a man. They actually listened and said, okay, this is how you do that. We seem to have lost that in more modern times. Is that a case of, when I look at, technology and things like that, we've shifted towards wanting to be more individual as opposed to part of the community group, and that's part of why the men have, they're now shut down and gone, okay, I need to be an individual and do this myself, because that's a sign of strength, as opposed to working as part of a community, which used to be seen as a sign of strength.
Yeah, what I think you perfectly described is what the way it looks like to me, and the
Mm,
research that I've been doing on this is that probably up to the time that we started living the agrarian life and having, agriculture and being stationary, not
mm,
nomadic, and being hunter gatherers,
mm,
was at that point that we started to settle in, and this idea of accumulation of wealth and accumulation of things, because we weren't carrying things around because we weren't nomadic as much then.
yeah.
When we were hunter gatherers, it was absolutely an essential part of survival for
Mm,
the entire community to work together, right?
mm,
Women had a role, men had a role, they worked together, and very often those roles interlaced with each other. So it wasn't just specifically the men went out and hunted and came back and had beer, and the women did the, berry picking and
yeah.
prepared the meals and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't that way. It was a much more integrated society. So yes, in that sense, you would have probably young men, or even some of the leaders would have these wise counselors. They would talk to people within the elders or shamans or whoever that was in the group that would
Mm,
help advise that. We started getting away from that, I think, when we became agrarian and started settling. And the focus then became on the individual, right?
mm,
I'm going to accumulate, more cattle. I'm going to have a larger piece of land, and I'm going to have, all these people working for me, et cetera, et cetera. And it of course took thousands of years to evolve this. And you're right, about 150 years ago or so, there was a kind of a movement afoot, especially here in the US, but also in Britain as well, where men were saying, well, women are taking over. They're teaching our schools now. They're coming into the workplace, and that kind of thing. We need to reassert ourselves as men. And this whole masculine machismo thing started a whole new life again. And it's been that way for the last
mm,
100, 200 years, where until probably 50, 60 years ago, when women started, you know, protesting and petitioning for their liberation from that kind of world that they lived in. So yes, in a lot of ways, we have moved away from that culture. And I think that's one of the things that has caused a lot of problems with people, is because now we've got all these men, particularly on an island somewhere,
mm.
not able to express their feelings and what's going on, and to ask for help and that kind of thing. So you got to understand, this is the most important thing to me to understand and to get across to people, is it's not men per se. It's a
Mm,
cultural problem that we're dealing with. It's not men.
mm,
I think a lot of times men hear that term toxic masculinity and they immediately shut down, because they see toxic coupled with masculinity and they think it's all men all the time, all men are bad. And that's not true. That's not what that means. So I guess the main thrust here is that we have a cultural problem of how we define masculinity. And I think in a lot of the young men that I'm talking to, I'd say millennials and Gen Zs, they're thinking the same thing. They're thinking, I don't think this is going to work for me. This is not the way I see myself. So I think there is some, as we said at the beginning of the show, there's a little bit of a crisis going on here now about
mm.
what it is to be masculine.
'Cause I like what you said before. It's like, can I be, I'm taking this like, can I be who I am and still be masculine? Is it a
Yes.
case of the person just simply needs to, or the man just, boy, man says, okay, this is who I'm going to be. and with a framework around that, obviously not being a complete and utter arsehole, but being someone who's a nice person that's giving and helping. But this is how I'm going to be, and just be firm in that, and regardless of what anybody else thinks, rather than trying to appease everybody else and set certain behaviors and be that person, whether it's got some feminine traits or some masculine traits, however it is. But it's like, I'm okay with me. Is that what we need to be teaching the young men?
I think that is what we need to be teaching them, because again, it's not a cookie cutter thing. And what we've been trying to do is force young boys into this model of masculinity that doesn't fit all boys. The important thing here is that this form of masculinity has some things in it, like I said, the suppression of emotion, the suppression of feelings, the inability sometimes to be able to ask for help, because men are supposed to know everything. They're supposed to be completely in control and in charge. Giving men permission, especially starting with boyhood, starting to give boys permission and men permission to do that, is going to free up a lot of some of these health issues that men seem to be having, mental health issues. And it is a crisis. I mean, I've been following along with one of the psychologists. I think his last name is Siegel, something like that. He's an Australian, and he's done a whole thing on men's health and the fact that we don't give a lot of resources and time and effort and focus on men's health, when it is certainly something that is very well recognized within psychology that is a problem right now. And that part of that problem, I think, is allowing men to be who they are, to allow them to be that, if it means even stepping outside of that traditional masculine role that we have been socialized to believe in. And one other thing is, little boys do this to little boys too. It's you don't follow the man code, the boy code, you get shamed and you get humiliated by a lot of people, and you wind up conforming even if you don't want to. And so that needs to be looked at as well, as this sort of shaming and humiliation that other men do to men to kind of keep them in the fold, if you will.
Yeah, okay. Those two good points there. We're going to end now for the radio listeners because we've run out of time. But we'll continue to unpack those 2 points you were talking about with mental health and men not asking for help, and that being a crisis, and also to this shame that's being used to help or to ensure men, young boys, conform. So we'll touch on that after the break. For the radio listeners, tune into the podcast for the balance of this. So let's come back to that point you mentioned about the mental health side of things. Do you think part of the reason men don't get the help they need is because we've had this attitude of we don't need help, so we're not allocating resources now, and those resources aren't there because we did need help? It's kind of like a bit of a cycle in itself, and we just need to wake that up, and those resources will come. Is that why you think it's happening?
Yeah. There's been a lot of discussion around that. I've heard, the idea that, well, men, even if you provide them with help, they won't go to it. But there have been recent studies that I've seen that say that if men have that available to them, they in fact will go to reach out and get the support they need. We don't put a lot of emphasis. I can only speak from living here in the United States, but I imagine it's probably true a lot in the Western countries. For mental health, it's all about physical health, medicine, but it's not about the mental health side of it. We've been cutting mental health programs in this country for 40 years now, and you can see the results of this. Just yesterday or the day before, there was a shooting in a school in Tennessee where 3 children were killed, 3 adults. That's a mental health crisis. And it's a gun problem too, but it's a mental health crisis at its root, because people are lashing out because they have nowhere to go to talk. Most of these shooters are young adult males. In this particular case, this individual, I think, was transgender, maybe a transgender male, but nevertheless, they're males by and large. That
Mm.
says to me that they're not getting the help that they need, and it is a crisis. And for what reason, all the inputs to that, I don't know, because we really haven't studied that as much, because we're not doing the work here.
Well, so from that perspective, with the mental health side of things, and yeah, I saw that news report on the shooting, and it was a big thing. And one of the reporters was specifically highlighting that this is a mental health issue. Yes, guns were used for shooting, but the reason the person did that was because of the mental health side of things.
Well, you have to think, if you're going to shoot a child
Mm,
with a military style rifle, there's got to be something wrong with you. I mean, that's the way I look at it.
yeah,
Killing anybody is not good. I wouldn't advocate that either. But the point
no.
is, if you're going to shoot a child point blank, there's something definitely wrong with the way you're thinking.
Yeah, and so with that support is, again, and you mentioned before about, if people have said, oh, if the resources there, men wouldn't go get help. But I want to relay a little bit of a story that I we did was one of the organisations I worked with. We created a dinner party. Well, it was a lunchtime where we had a whole bunch of men and women we knew were from strong families. We had two prominent psychologists come in, and they were asking them questions, and we were filming this session so that we could take out bites that we could use as information bits to share with people. As psychologists will ask a question about a problem that people are facing, and these people would answer the question. As I was directing, because I was directing it, I noticed that the men started doing a lot of the talking, and I got concerned, coming from a corporate background where it's talked about how the men dominate the board conversations and women can't speak. So I spoke to the women off camera, because we had more people than there were seats, and I said, I'm getting concerned the men are doing all the talking, and all of them stood up and said, no, we never hear men talking about this stuff. We're loving listening. Is it a case of, I took away from that given the safe space, men will open up? Is it a case of creating this safe space rather than saying, oh, you toxic masculine man, and having that and jumping down people's throats, but actually saying, okay, we need to understand a bit more, have a bit more listening? Is that what would help, do you think?
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. And I think what you're saying is correct. What you're doing is you're saying, we're giving you a space here, and you have permission to talk about it. You have the permission to talk about your feelings and so forth. Now, I don't know how they might feel about doing that if Clint Eastwood had been in the room, and Schwarzenegger and a few other sort of idealized masculine heroes. But the reality is they were given the space to be able to talk and express how they feel and stuff. I think men will do that. I think they will do. I think the idea is that we just typically don't give men that kind of space to work with. I like you, worked in a corporate environment as well. And I know that, and I worked in IT, which is a very masculine profession area. I was kind of hoping during the 80s that it would change as more women came in, but it really has kind of stayed similar, kind of a sort of macho culture that goes with it. But the idea is that in a corporate environment, you may find it more difficult to be able to do something like that. But if you give them a space in which they can share, men will do that. It's not like we're not capable of doing it. It's that we don't allow ourselves to do it. And we're not very often sort of given permission to say, you know what, for 1 hour, I'm going to say, step out of this costume that you wear, we call masculinity. Take it off, put it down. You're just a human being now. Talk to me about what's going on in your head. And given that kind of permission, I think men are very capable and very willing to talk.
Well, and I want to relay another, because you mentioned about whether men would do that with Arnold Schwarzenegger or Clint Eastwood in the room. And I had because one of the roles that I worked was I supervised a lot of large construction projects. And I remember it was quite a number of years ago now, but what I was doing is, as I was walking around the construction site, I would talk with the people. Mostly it was guys, and I'd share a couple of funny videos about how men and women related, that kind of thing. And it stimulated some conversations and made things a bit lighter. But I always like to try and open up that conversation and give that space for people to open up. And there was one time where I did that, and after everyone left, there was this big guy. It was your Arnold Schwarzenegger type guy, but tattoos, all that kind of thing. He was almost bored. He literally had, you could see there was tears in his eyes, and he said, and the short of this discussion was that him and his wife, were basically about to break up, and he didn't know what to do about it. He tried so many different things, didn't know what to do about it. And I suggested that I gave him a video to watch that was on YouTube that is about bringing together, people, how men and women. It was a marriage video. It was called "Laugh Your Way to a Better Marriage" by Mark Gungor. And I said, watch this where your wife's going to walk past. If she's interested, tell her why you're doing it, that you want to, and that you want to try and fix the marriage, and see what happens. Then I bumped into him 2 months later, and apparently their whole marriage had completely shifted. They were, sending the kids off places so they could go back and, sneak off and be romantic together. And it was, again, that's why I wonder if from that perspective, do we need to be shifting it from, rather than having this big attack and going, oh, it's toxic masculinity, which we can talk about that later, I'm yet to define something that is actually purely male, that's a behavior that is only male in that category. But do we need to be having the conversation that way and saying, hey, let's talk about this, rather than having this attacking style?
I agree. In fact, I've kind of have put toxic masculinity back on the shelf. The reason for it is, and when we talk about it in more depth, I can explain how I see toxic masculinity, but because it's like taking a baseball bat and walking into a room with a blindfold on and swinging a bat at people and hitting and knocking people out. You don't know who you're going to hit. You don't know how it's going to affect them, and so forth and so on. I agree with you. I think we need whatever we need to do that will reach, especially men, and make them feel comfortable, and make them feel accepted, and make them feel open to these kinds of discussions. I think that's what we need to be doing right now. I'm not anti-men, but I do think that masculinity and how we've defined that is a bit dated. And I think that we need to look at where we are culturally and see if there are ways that we can make changes to that masculinity that makes it more amenable for men to be able to do what we're talking about. That's a great story. It really touched my heart there that you telling me about this big guy, because I always look at the way I look at big guys, like, biker guys or whatever, big men who are tattooed and everything else, is inside that guy is a little boy. Right? That little boy probably was told very early on in life what it was to be a man. And that outward expression that you see of this guy, now he may have naturally been big, but then a lot of times guys build themselves up to get bigger and bigger because they feel that's how they can be a man. That's how they can express their masculinity. But for him to be vulnerable enough to tell you, with almost tears coming down, that he was desperate and he needed to be able to do something, and he didn't know what to do. Wow, that was great. And the advice you gave him was perfect. I mean, obviously it worked great because he connected with his wife again. But think about how that changed his life and changed his wife's life as well, and their kids and everything else. So what a great story that is.
Well, that's what I wonder from that perspective of how we approach things, because it seems to me, and when we talk about that kind of behavior, I don't often watch the news, but I happened to watch it last night and I caught the article that we talked about before. But also, too, there was another one, similar sort of thing here in Australia, where I don't know what it was. It was about a woman talking about being womanly. I didn't forget the story of it, but the point was there was a massive amount of other women from a gay and lesbian background that were violently attacking this. She had to be surrounded by police. There would have been about 15 police surrounding her while all these women are trying to throw punches in and throw stuff across, and I'm going, is this? And you mentioned that before about the behaviors go across both genders. And this is where I was coming from, that perspective. When I looked at toxic masculinity, it talks about, men's behaviors that are, bad. I'm going to put it in that nutshell. But when you look at all the different behaviors, so show me a behavior that's only done by men. I'm yet to find one, that's where I'm wondering, is this whole attitude of attacking to try and solve the problem. If you attack someone, naturally they're going to get defensive, and as you would, anyone would if they're attacked. And do we need to be having those discussions rather than saying, hey, bad man, smacking all men on the head, but having said, hey, there are examples like that where men have problems, we have feelings, we have emotions, and that's okay. Attacking us, we're just going to go like a tortoise into our shell and stay there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I really do. That's why I think approaching this with a kind of inquisitive approach to it. How do you feel about this? What can we do to make this more amenable to more men? How can we make men feel more comfortable with being who they are? A lot of what we see, and we might as well just hit that toxic masculinity for a quick second here.
Yep.
Because I don't think masculinity is toxic, as we stated, and I think that's where the confusion for men is. Because the minute they hear that, and men have been hearing for years that men have been doing bad things and all that kind of stuff, and not all men do bad things, but toxic masculinity, in my opinion, is a corruption of what masculinity could be. It is demonstrated by things like dominance, suppressing other people, abusing and exploiting people, and that kind of thing. And not all men do that, right? Not all men exemplify that behavior. But unfortunately, sometimes that stuff gets put up as being desirable for a man. It shows that he's dominant, that he's in control, that he's got his life in some kind of order in which he's the primary and everybody else is secondary to him. And I think that, to me, is the thing that is the corruption of what men could be. And a lot of men get told that simply because they're men. So I look at it like this. Masculinity is over here. I'm trying to get my hands on the screen. And males, are over here. Masculinity is something that is not inherent. You are not born with these traditional masculine values. You are taught these values, and you go through life. Now, are there differences between men and women physiologically? Yes. Are there differences hormonally? Yes. Are there even neurologically? There are differences in men and women. But essentially, these terms that we use, masculinity and femininity, very often are these costumes that we wear as men. And if they're not comfortable, then we should take them off and redo it. You can redo a suit, you can redesign clothes, you can whatever, and we can make something that's more comfortable, not only for ourselves as men, but also in the greater scheme of sharing the planet with females and people who are in different places in terms of gender identity and so forth. We can share this thing together, and we can still all be who we are without having to be in this rigid bucket that says this is what men do and this is what men can't do. And I think it's what men can't do that causes the problem. That's the thing that really hangs up growth for men emotionally, and growth, in a lot of other ways.
What do you mean by what men can't do?
Like they can't express certain emotions, right?
Okay.
That's something that here's an interesting thing. This is backed in science, right? The idea that little baby boys cry more emotional than little girl babies are, right? They always are that way. Now, what happens is by the time they're 4 and 5 years old, that excessive emotion really kind of gets, and I'm using this term figuratively,
Mm.
speaking out of them, right? So that they're not able to express those things. So they're all
Mm.
using examples like there's peer pressure, there's parental pressure, comes from both mother and father sometimes.
Mm.
We want our son to be a normal boy, right? And
Mm.
normal boys don't do this. So not being able to express emotion is one of those things they can't do. Not asking for help, like we said, that's a vulnerability thing. Men are supposed to be in control all the time. They're not supposed to ask for help. That's
Mm.
another thing that needs to be examined very closely. And what I'm saying is not necessarily let's take the pendulum and swing it the other direction. But what I'm saying is give it some room so that we can do those things when it's necessary for us to do them. Because that's being a human being. And we are humans, whether we're
Mm.
male or female, we're all human beings, and emotions
Mm.
are part of a fundamental part of human behavior. So those are just things that are almost like arbitrarily been assigned from way back when that men
Mm.
can't do certain things. And a lot of those things, I think emotion is probably one of the highest things on the list,
Mm.
causes more internal problems with men. If they suppress emotions, which most men find themselves doing sometimes, what happens is that builds up like a pressure cooker and eventually comes out some way or another, whether it's an internal thing where you start attacking yourself health wise, or it comes out as violence. And see, that's what the world sees. They see, oh, men are just naturally violent, aren't they?
Mm.
No, I don't think we are. I think what happens is we're not allowed to vent that out
Mm.
so that we don't have these occurrences of violence and aggression.
I love that point that you've just made there, that men are not, because of they don't have the ability to let this out, it builds up into that violent aggression. Um, that's an interesting point that you've raised there. I want to come back to this suppressing part of it, because you mentioned about, talking about toxic masculinity, and
Mhm.
it being, oppression, suppressing. But in reality, I mean, while it may be seen on the surface as a sign of strength, the reality is that it's really a sign of weakness. Because
Oh,
if
it's
you
most definitely is a sign of weakness. You're absolutely right. But it doesn't come out that way if you're the person being oppressed or you're being suppressed by it. We all know that people that tend to be narcissistic, people that tend to be these kind of dominant types, are really extremely insecure individuals at their core. But if they're wielding the power to do that, whatever oppression, suppression is that they're doing,
Mm.
manipulating or abusing people,
Yeah,
um, if you're the person that's receiving that, the person has got the power. You don't.
yeah,
Doesn't matter whether it's coming from a good place or a bad place, which naturally it is coming from a bad place. But yes, you're absolutely right. It is insecurity. And I think part of that, Damien, is the fact that these are men who are trying desperately to prove that they're men, right?
mm,
They're being masculine, right? They have to prove it all the time. It's one of those things you can never really sit back and say, I'm comfortable in my masculinity. I don't have to do this. I don't have to prove it to anybody. Because we live in a world in which you do have to constantly prove your masculinity over and over again. That's another thing that I think causes more problems than it's worth.
that's an interesting point that you raise, and I'll come back to my military experience there as well, because all the guys that I was with, these guys were lethal. But if you didn't know if you saw them on the street, if you didn't know they were in the military, you would never know. They had nothing to prove. They didn't have to prove they were manly.
Exactly.
They knew that they knew inside who they were, that they could
Yeah,
do what they needed to do. So they didn't have
right.
to run around going, "Hey, I'm a tough guy," because they knew that in a situation, and I think that's where we come back to that symbol of the warrior. I'm told by someone that the original symbol of a warrior was a spear, but it was broken. They had the power, but they didn't need to use it.
Yeah, you absolutely spot on. And I would imagine that every one of those men that you were with
Mm,
had one thing in common, and that's confidence. They had
mm,
confidence in who they were. They had confidence in who they were as people, and it really didn't matter what the world thought about them or whatever. They had nothing to prove to people.
Yeah.
They knew that in a situation where they had to, they could defend themselves, they could take care of themselves. But as you said, and I like to think of this like and I wrote about this in one of the books about, there was a show on many years ago, back in the 70s,
Mm.
called Kung Fu. It had David Carradine in it. He
Yeah, I know
was
the show.
a
Yeah.
land monk. I think a lot of people have seen that show, know a little bit about it.
Yeah.
But the thing that intrigued me about that show was this. He walked out through the wild west of the United States, and he had nothing but a satchel on his shoulder. He had no weapons. He had nothing. I think he might have had some of those little stars, but I don't know that he carried anything on him. He
Mm.
just had his hands and feet in his head. But he did everything he possibly could to avoid fighting if he could.
Mm.
If he had to, he could. And to me, this is the thing that I try to tell highly sensitive men, particularly. Well, hopefully, we could talk about that somewhere in the show, because that's, I think, a key point here, is to walk with confidence. To walk with confidence is not to be arrogant. It's not to be strutting around. It's just to walk in yourself and know that you've got nothing to prove to anybody.
I love that, to walk with confidence. Well, let's go there with the sensitive men, because you have written quite a bit on that. But from that, because I have a number of friends who are quite sensitive, and working with one at the moment who's got some issues that he's working with, and getting him to say, hey, you need to stand up in this situation. You need to stand up. The world is not going to come to your rescue. You've actually got to stand up for what you want. It's got to do with your kids. You need to stand up. And and I understand he's not feeling confident at all. So I'm trying to help him feel confident, but I can't stand in his shoes. I can't do it for him. He has to do it himself. How do we, let's start with your work on, highly sensitive men, and what you found there, and then relay that back to being manly.
Okay, let me just say one thing about your friend real quick.
Mm.
The more, I think one of the things that helps highly sensitive men, particularly to start that path of walking more with confidence about being sensitive. Okay, and we'll talk about sensitive in a minute. It's probably not what your audience thinks it is, but is the idea that he needs to educate himself more about the trait, to find out more. There's lots of books out there now. Of course, I've got a couple of books, but there are other great books. Dr. Elaine Aron has her seminal book, which was written in the mid 90s, on the trait. She was the person who really discovered high sensitivity as a temperament trait. And those are the kind of things that will help build his confidence, because I think a lot of times men, particularly, who are sensitive, a little bit emotional, a little bit more sensitive to things around them, and we'll explain that in a second, are less confident because it doesn't line up with what they've been taught about what men are supposed to be. And so usually at an early age, they start to doubt. Remember, we talked about confidence being the way, if you want to circumvent this whole business about having to compensate on everything being a man, you start out being confident. And you start building that confidence in yourself by educating yourself about, especially for sensitive men, about the trait itself. The more they know, the more they'll realize that it's not a liability. It's actually quite an asset. So just so I wanted to throw that in there, because it's always important. I think it's like 3 E's for me: educate yourself, embrace the trait, and then go out and educate other people about it. And that's the 3 things I think that highly sensitive men and highly sensitive people should be doing. But let's talk about the trait for a second.
Yeah.
There are 4 characteristics that we have right now. And understand this trait has only been around sort of under the research auspices in the last 30 years or so. So it's relatively new. There is a lot of research that needs to be done on it. But first things first, this trait is called sensory processing sensitivity. Okay, it's more commonly referred to as high sensitivity. And I think popularly people think of this as being, well, these people are overly emotional. They can't handle stress. They wilt, under pressure and all that kind of stuff. That's not true at all. That's not really the way it is. What people are seeing is the outward manifestations of an individual who is not confident in their ability to deal with some of the challenges that come along with high sensitivity, but they haven't been taught and socialized how to process some of this stuff either. And that's where the education part comes in. It helps highly sensitive people deal with those challenges. But again, sensory processing sensitivity is the scientific name.
Yeah.
It falls under a broader theory called environmental sensitivity. And and this is important, environmental sensitivity is really a theory about how an organism reacts to its environment. Are they sensitive to change? Are they not sensitive to change? So you can start to see the sensitive part is really kind of like a sensitive instrument. Can it detect change in the environment? And highly sensitive people are people who can detect changes around them in the environment, whether they're sensory things or they're environmental things or emotional things, much more accurately than other people do because we're wired that way. Okay. So the environmental sensitivity theory is a spectrum. Everybody has sensitivity. You wouldn't exist on this planet if you didn't have some sensitivity because you walk into danger and get clobbered, right?
Yeah.
Highly sensitive people are on the upper end of the spectrum. There are other people that are on the lower end of the spectrum, right? These are the people I like to think are the risk takers. They're the people who push the envelope. They're the people who move us forward in maybe a little bit reckless way, but it's necessary. It's an important thing to be able to do to move us forward. Highly sensitive people are the cautious advisor. Remember we talked about that in the hunter-gatherer society. We're the shamans, we're the priestly caste and all that. We're the ones who are the ones that are thoughtful and are aware of things in danger. We're kind of the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah.
In fact, it's considered to be an evolutionary quality. I don't think it would have ever survived if it had for the fact that it was important in nature.
Yeah.
In fact, nature builds this into 100 different animal species as well. So it's not just humans that have this.
Yeah.
So that's the groundwork. Let me stop for a second, see if there's anything you want to ask about there, because otherwise
No, keep going. I mean, I'm taking notes as I'm going, so I'm looking down, I'm taking those notes, but I'm definitely listening. It's just exciting.
Well, let me get into the four main characteristics, and that'll help a little bit more define what highly sensitive people are. Now, you can use Dr. Aaron uses an acronym, DOES, DOES, and each one of those stands for something. D stands for depth of processing. Highly sensitive people process information in a much deeper level. We are deep dive with things. We deep dive with emotional stuff. We deep dive with problems and so forth. So because of your military background, we may not be the best people to take out on a battlefield when you have to make decisions like this, right?
Yeah.
But if we're in the back end somewhere planning some strategic move or something, we might be the people you want to go to because we get the big picture and we also have that ability to connect things together. Highly sensitive people are very creative that way too. They can take A, B, and make C and D come out of that because of that deep processing, but it's very deliberate, very slow, and it's part of what we do. O stands for overstimulation because we do get overstimulated. I mean, I like to think of it like this, Damien, is that if you look at a camera, aperture on a camera, the more open it is, the more light it comes in, the less open it is, the less light comes in. That's the way our sort of filtering mechanism for sensory data is that we don't have better eyes, obviously, or wear glasses or hearing or anything else. It's the filtering that goes on back here that lets it to the parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, et cetera, that has to process this information. So ours is a little more wide open. And because of that, like any computer, right, you can get over, if you have too many apps running at once, you're going to overload the system. And that's what happens to highly sensitive people sometimes. That's one of those outward manifestations that people see. They say, oh, these guys can't handle anything. They got to shut down and go, well, hell yeah, that's because the more data we get more data. And so that affects too our emotional part, which is the letter E. It's that emotional reactivity part. We deeper, and we also process emotions at a much deeper level. So we fall in love harder. We get hurt more easily, right? Yeah. Because our emotions run very deep with us.
Mm.
But it also triggers a greater sense of empathy. We feel what other people are feeling sometimes, not in a magical woo-woo way, but just by cues they give us, by looking at the way they talk, by observing all these wonderful cues that people give off in nonverbal and verbal that we pick up. So that gives us something that makes us more empathetic. And the last thing on that list is the S, which is sensing the subtle in the environment. And that, to me, is really the key. It's being able to see things that other people aren't seeing. And that, to me, creates the one thing that highly sensitive people have that is an advantage, and that is awareness, right? See that somebody's driving the bus off the cliff and you're the only one that sees that, and you can alert the driver to stop, then that awareness is worth the price of admission, right? Because that is an awareness about what's going on around us. To me, that's probably the most significant thing that highly sensitive people have. And I think that's the evolutionary part is because it's baked into the population. And there are about 2 billion people on the planet that have this trait. So it's about 20 to 30% of the human population. So that's our baseline. That's kind of where a high sensitivity is. What people see when they talk to sensitive people very often is, like your friend, maybe a lack of confidence in what they feel like maybe they're not measuring up to some other measurement that isn't going to work for them. It's never going to work for them.
Yeah.
So they need to understand the trait a little bit more. But that's what people see, and they think, well, that's not what we want. And men particularly don't want to be associated with this term sensitivity. I know it took me 10 years after I read Elaine Aron's book to say, okay, that's me. That's really me.
Yeah.
I knew inherently that it was, but it was just fighting that sort of training that I'd gotten since childhood.
Sounds and I'm relaying this to Star Wars, and it sounds like it's kind of like you highly sensitive people have got more in touch with the Force, and they understand what's going on, they can feel what's going on, and if they can manage that well, they can actually be more attuned to what's going on as well, and being able to process things and act with that. Is that part of that process as well, or is it just?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think that's a perfect analogy. Is the Star Wars? I mean, in the right hands, the Force is a good thing. In the wrong hands, it's a Darth Vader thing, right? So, yeah. I think that's part of the problem right now is that the awareness within the highly sensitive population is not really where it should be. Every day, people are learning about it. There's getting more and more information is being disseminated. In fact, I'm going to do a shameless plug here, but in the summer of this year, there is a movie that's coming out, a documentary about highly sensitive men called Sensitive Men Rising. And that will be out this summer to helpfully reach out to highly sensitive men so that they feel like there's some connection they have with other men. I think for highly sensitive men particularly, they feel like they're alone, right? You're already kind of on an island being a man, but now you're a sensitive man. Boy, you're really on an island then, because you really don't want to talk about it to anybody that you've got these feelings and emotions. And these are things that we're wired to do. It's not something it's optional for us. It is just the way we're wired.
But isn't that what women want as well? If we put in that category, women want a sensitivity.
They say that.
They say, well, I think it's a fine balance, because the women I've talked to, I'm sure they're out there, but the ones that I've talked to all have the same approach where they want that sensitivity, and they also want the strength side of things. That's why I was using that Force analogy, because the sensitivity gives you great ability to have that connection. But having the ability to control it as well gives you great ability to move forward. So knowing when to allow it to come through, and knowing when to just, I need to be in control in this situation.
Right. And maybe I was being a little harsh on the women there, but the idea is that for all of my life, I've been hearing this: we want a sensitive man, but we want a hyper masculine guy at the same time. So it's kind of a contradiction in what they're saying. But the reality is, I think, to be truthful, highly sensitive men aren't going to probably be ideal for a lot of women because they don't like too much emotion, or they may feel that it's a little bit overpowering for them. And that's fine. Again,
Is that true though? I mean, because I think about that, and I would put myself in that category of highly sensitive. I know, from when I was younger, I was very sensitive to a lot of things around me, and I mean that was quite overwhelming. I didn't know what that was, but now, as with a lot of things that I've gone through, I still think I'm very sensitive, but I have a very good ability to, if there's a situation where I need to just be focused, I can focus it. But then I have my time where I call it gumping. I actually have turned into a bit of a Forrest Gump. I got rid of my gardener, and down the beach house I have this very big lawn, and I bought a self-propelled lawnmower, and I just go out there with a lawnmower like Forrest Gump and go up and down, and that's my space where I can detune and allow those things to come through. Is it?
You're a man after my own heart. I had a fairly large house in California, and that was I call it the zen of yard work, right? I'd go out and I'd go out for hours, and I didn't care if it was 105 degrees outside or not. I would go out and do that. It was a mindless task most of the time because I'd done it so many times before, but it was a great way to get into a flow state and to get into this ability to just freeform think, and that was good.
Yeah.
But back to your point, again, it's the perception of sensitivity, I think, that throws a lot of women off. If they see that a man is sensitive, they think, they're going to be overly sensitive all the time and that kind of thing. But again, going back to your point with yourself, the idea is learning to regulate your emotions. That's an important. That's one of the things that highly sensitive people very seldom are taught. Very seldom taught how to regulate emotions, how to flow with the emotion, not suppress it, but at the same time, don't let it. It's like a fire hose, letting it get out of control. You can't. It doesn't do you any good when it's like that. It's flapping around everything. So the idea is that you want to be able to use that for some useful purpose. And I think as more and more highly sensitive men start understanding, and more highly sensitive people start understanding that emotional regulation part is part and parcel of learning to sort of control the force, if you will, so that you can use it for your best good and for those around you as well.
Do we need to, from that perspective, I mean, because I want to make this a bit practical as well, for the guys that are highly sensitive, and I care about this because I think I fell into that category. Well, I did. I think I fall into that category, and I put it from the context of, if you are in that space, as it comes back to what you were talking about before, and this is the note that I made earlier, is where is it? I've got lots of notes. You got lots of useful information. I got some notes here. It said you can be. I can be who I am and still be masculine. Is this a case of, from that perspective, if you fall into that category of highly sensitive, and we put that into that category of we'll put it in the framework of the dating side of things, where you meet someone and the woman goes, well, he might be a little bit too sensitive. You can recognize that as a man and go, well, okay, she doesn't appreciate that. Move on to the next one. And I put that in the context, and I'll relay another story from my military time. There was a guy that we're on base with. He was a reasonably good-looking guy, but he was not very bright, in our opinion. But he was always dating these amazing women. They were beautiful, they were intelligent, they were kind, they were doctors and lawyers and things like that. So they're really, really smart women. And we're looking, my friends and I are looking at it going, you're, how? You're not that bright. I mean, yes, you're good looking, and maybe you've got something lower that's, appealing as well. This is the thought process we're going through. And finally, one day I thought, I'm going to ask him. So I went up and I said, Shane, you're not that bright. I actually said this to him. You're not that bright. How is it you're dating all these women? And he said to me, he turned into, and I'll use it for another Star Wars analogy, he turned into a wise Obi-Wan. He put his hand around my shoulder and he said, Damien, what you don't see is I ask a lot of women. Most of them say no. You just see the ones that say yes. And it was, so do we need to, like, from a practical point of view, for the men out there, in what manly is, and coming back to your point, is being okay with you and having confidence in that and saying, hey, I am sensitive. And if you don't recognize that, I'll find someone who does. Do we need to?
Yeah, but I think there's one difference here. And I agree with you. It is a numbers game, right?
Yeah.
When you're dating, it is a numbers game. I won't deny that.
Mm.
Highly sensitive men have that awareness too.
Mm.
And that awareness is sensing what somebody may be saying without saying it. You know what I mean? So they can pick up on things, I think, a lot of times that other men would just go right over their head.
Yeah.
Because they have that sort of, again, that ability to process a lot of sensory information at once. My advice, and it's been just my experience, and I'm no dating expert here, but the idea is that if the women that you're pursuing are I guess what you'd call almost traditional females, and they're looking for a traditional male, you may have difficulty with that. Now, you may break through once in a while with that, and that may work fine. But I think the idea is recognizing that you're not going to be everybody's cup of tea. And if that's the case, then that's okay. That's that walking with the confidence of who you are. You will find somebody, and that somebody will appreciate you for all that you are, not just the exterior part of you, but also the complexity of who you are as a man and as a sensitive man.
Yeah.
And that's important.
Well, and this is where we're coming back to, we're talking about what is this framework for being manly, and for highly sensitive men as well. Is it, this case of, because if we're to look at it, there's women that are highly sensitive, and women, I've dated some women that are not sensitive at all, and it's like they definitely fall into what would be a stereotypical, no emotion man perspective, and it's like I'm going, whoa, this is really weird. Is it a case of recognizing, from that perspective of being, a person recognizing they're okay with who they are, and that's okay?
Well, yeah, because what happens is if you're okay with who you are and somebody is, rejecting you or saying that you're not what they are looking for, then you're going to be okay with that. You're going to realize that you tried, it didn't work out. And this is the thing that I think for a lot of highly sensitive people is that they take it to heart and take it too personally. That is internalizing that rejection and saying there's something wrong with me. And for a lot of highly sensitive people, men in particular, they've been hearing that message their whole life. And so it's like a loop. It plays back over and over again. By understanding the trait, understanding who you are with that trait, it will help, I think, start initiating, building that confidence. And I certainly think one of the things that's really important as this trait becomes more well known and more parents become aware of it, that they will start working with their children, particularly their highly sensitive boys, in a different way than they might do if the child was not highly sensitive. And frankly, I think they should do it with all boys. I don't think we should delineate necessarily highly sensitive should be this way or that way, and other boys should be another way. But just recognizing the fact that highly sensitive boys are a different cut. They're just, think about the human genome for a minute. How many different, infinite ways the genome has been expressed throughout history. And it is on a planet with 7 billion people, or almost 8 billion now. How many different people, individuals, just at a genetic level, we have on the planet. So everybody's not going to be the same. Even within the highly sensitive community, there's going to be variation. It's only one aspect of our personality. It's not the whole, it's not the sum total of who you are.
Yeah. Just as you were talking about that, I'm thinking about, because you're talking about, the highly sensitive people, they take it personally. And is that, because one of the things, I have a negotiation program in there, and what I teach in that, and one of the bases within the program is to separate the person from the behavior. Is it a case where we need to be doing that when working, with people as a whole, but especially with highly sensitive people? They themselves need to recognize who I am is not, yes, I'm sensitive and I'm recognizing this and I'm getting these feelings, but that's different from my own self-worth.
and that, in a lot of ways, that's just reframing what's coming in, right? What you're what you're hearing, what you're seeing, what you're sensing, somebody is rejecting it, right? And I think the natural response, and it could be a thing for highly sensitive people, it could be for anybody, is that something wrong with me, and therefore I should feel bad about this because I failed somewhere. Absolutely right. You separate that from the reality is that you don't know what that person is bringing with them, the baggage they're bringing in their life,
or what their intention is. It might not be a good intention to, they might be doing that to manipulate you.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that highly sensitive people need to be more aware of, is that because it's very often they say that narcissists prey very heavily on highly sensitive people because they're easy marks, right? They're easy to manipulate. They sort of go together like, puzzle pieces. But highly sensitive people, because of their empathy, are trying to always, present the narcissistic person in a better light than they should. And what is ultimately they get manipulated. So a lot of that has to do with getting highly sensitive people to be educated more about how they frame things as it's coming into them, especially for things like rejection. Because if you start believing that everybody's rejecting you, well, then of course you start this whole idea, and your self-confidence starts going down the toilet again, and you don't want that to happen. There's exercises and things you can do to help reframe. I'm sure you've worked with that before as well. But it's one of those things you have to catch it before it becomes emotionally embedded inside of you. And that's part of that, being aware and confident about who you
are. I'm really glad that you went to that not only the narcissist thing, but the fit together of the narcissist and the highly sensitive person. Because when I think back to, there was a period in my life where, and so I really think I fit that category, where some of the people I dated, and I found myself bending over backwards trying to please these people. Because of things that they were saying to me and going, that's an issue I need to fix. That's an issue I need to fix. There's an issue I need to fix, and constantly changing to. And it didn't matter what you did; it was always something extra that they had to say, and became manipulation. And it wasn't until I recognized that I'm an okay person as I am, that cycle changed. And that's why I wanted to really touch, and I'm glad you went there, because is it a case of, when we're talking about masculinity, it's not this masculinity of being this tough person and being oppressive, but it's actually being true to who you are. That's what masculinity is. And being confident, we come back to that word confident again, that it's, I'm a sensitive person and that's okay.
Yes. Yes.
And
that's where I think we need to, especially the people who are working to educate people about high sensitivity, need to make sure that message gets out there to highly sensitive people, and to anybody really, that it's okay to be sensitive. It's not a weakness. It's not a frailty. If you look at it from the point of view that we did with the metaphor of the Star Wars Force, then you kind of see it in a different way. A lot of people who are now publishing stuff or using the term superpower, I'm not really crazy about that term, because I think it's just simply who we are. This is what nature gave us. Other people that are not highly sensitive have other tools that we don't have. And so it all comes out to me as a natural balance. So having a superpower doesn't make me better than anybody else. It just means that I'm into something that maybe they're not. Like, if, for example, if you were hiring a trail guide to walk a trail, right? You'd want somebody who was sensitive to the environment that you're walking through, because they can detect.
You want to hear the bear out in the woods that other people might miss.
They might see a bear track or a mountain lion track or something that you don't see, and say, let's steer this way. Or you might know where the views are, where things are beautiful, whatever. But you want somebody that's sensitive to that environment. And so that's where I think I like to use that metaphor, especially for men, because it's a little more nuts and bolts. But the idea is that it's a good thing to have this. It's not a bad thing, you know. And the
Mm.
other stuff that we have to deal with, the challenges and the obstacles sometimes that come up because of overwhelm and all the other things that I talked about, those things can be managed if
Mm.
you consciously put some effort to do that.
Well, that's what I'm wondering from that confidence side of things, and owning that behavior and being okay with it. I mean, as you were talking about that there, and being and I was coming back to the dating side of things, which is where, you know, some of these, a lot of these issues, people go, you know, they're especially sensitive people. I was thinking, it popped into my head as you're talking, that a guy on a date who's highly sensitive, starting the conversation going, hey, just to let you know, I'm a highly sensitive male and I'm okay to show that emotion. And if you're not okay with that, we probably need to end this now. And I could imagine a lot of women that I've spoken to when we're having these conversations would go, oh my God, that's so hot. Because
Yeah,
he's got the confidence to own it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, if that's what you're moved to do, then by all
Yeah.
means do it. I mean, like I said, it's a part of me. I may have a mole on the back of my bit lower back, but I don't tell people about it. Nevertheless, it's
Yeah.
just part of who I am. So this is a major part of who I am. This personality trait, and eventually I work it into the conversation.
Mm,
Um, let them know this is who I am and where I'm coming from and that kind of stuff.
mm,
Um, and if we're in a movie and some really touching scene comes into play and I am moved by it, I'm not going to bawl, but I'm going to be like one of those guys that has, oh yeah, there's dust in the room because the tears are coming. But I'm going to be honest about it. I was moved by it. I
mm.
felt that. I'm
Well,
not ashamed.
yeah, I've been in movies where I've bawled my eyes out, and it's like, suck it up. If you don't like it, go. And the girl that I was
Exactly.
with was like, oh my God, he's so sensitive.
Yeah, but
um,
it's a kind of a
so
cool thing, I think. I
that's what
mean,
I think.
if you're watching a movie, I mean, a movie is about, to me, what
Yeah.
makes a movie effective is, does it move you to some emotion? Are
Mm,
you get through with it? Are you uh, angry about something? Are you sad about something? Are you touched by something? If it
mm.
does that, then the movie's worth the money, right? Or, to me, it has to do that kind of thing to be worthwhile to me. That's really important to me.
Yeah. So I mean, I really, because I love what, coming back to that statement about, you said at the start about being your own person, and this is where I'm wondering from that perspective, because I know, you know, there's so many articles about women wanting men to express more emotion. Same token, they want men to be confident as well. I mean, to confidently say I'm a highly sensitive man, that's got to tick all the boxes from that perspective. Is how I'm seeing that. I
Well,
could be wrong. I'm going to
you
ask
would
those
think.
questions going forward, but
Yeah,
it seems to
you would
be,
think.
yeah.
Yeah.
Is that? I mean, and is that where we're coming back to this whole framework of being manly? It is again owning who you are or who
Yeah.
you choose to be. You can be
And
whoever
I
you want to
and
be.
I and I think the important thing here, Damien, is this: is that a sensitive guy may approach masculinity a little bit different than, say, a guy, let's say it's on the other end of the spectrum, right, who's
Mm,
much less sensitive about things. They may take it much more as a traditional man or traditional masculinity may be more comfortable for them. But the
mm,
idea is masculinity, being manly, should allow you to be whoever it is you are, that
mm,
authentic part of you, so that you can live confidently with who you are. And I think that's the one thing. You were mentioning women earlier. I think they want, you see this on dating sites all the time. One of the core things that women want is a man who knows who they are and is confident about who they are. And that just
mm,
seems to be a recurring thing that I see over and over again. So you can still be confident and you can be sensitive and you can still be a man, and all those things can go together in a definition of masculinity that allows it, that allows to have a broad framework where a lot of different types of men can fall under that umbrella of what we call masculinity.
Yeah, I love that from that perspective of knows who they are and is confident in who they are. That's a framework in and of itself. You know, I think that's an overarching framework for what is manly. It's not, you know, you're. I mean, because I look at it from that perspective. In my house, if there's a bug in the house, I don't squish it. I go and I throw it outside, still alive.
Right.
Unless it's a really venomous spider that knows really venomous, and then I don't want it coming back in, so I'll squish that. But
Yeah.
but it's like,
And you guys have a lot of those, don't you?
yeah. No, well, they're not little; they're big. Australia, we have big bugs. No,
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying.
but I'm okay with that. And if someone, we had this the other day with my dad. My dad and I mean, we have a great relationship now. And we went through a period when I was a teenager and thought I knew everything and all that kind of stuff, But my dad and I, when we see each other, we always tell each other we love each other. We give each other a hug. And what was really cool, and I'm okay. I don't really care what anybody else thinks. Whenever my dad's there, I'll walk up to him wherever we are and give him a big hug and say, "Yeah, I love you, Dad." A week and a half ago, we were at a place where my dad hangs out. And so couple of his old work buddies were there from when he was a kid, from when he was an apprentice. And, I was going and I was about to walk off and I didn't really think about it because I was just heading off. And he goes, "Oi." And he called and put his arms out and said, "Give us a hug." And so I come back, give him a hug. But one of those work buddies said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And my dad turned around and said, "Oi, he's my son. I can give him a hug. It's okay." And it was like, it was
very cool.
Yeah, it was really cool. And that's where that my dad owned it, which was really cool. And this is what's right for me, and I don't really care what you think. And not only that, I'm just going to tell you to bugger off. And he didn't have to get into a big defense, but he just said, "This is right for me." Not saying this guy shouldn't. He can have whatever opinion he wants, but my dad owned it. That it was his feelings. This was how he was going to behave. And is that coming back under that framework, talking about knowing what's right for you, knowing who you are, and being confident in what's right for you?
Absolutely, and I applaud your father for that too, and you for. I mean, I know that as I was growing up, my father was not a hugger, was not really physical about how he showed love and so forth. And I made a point of making sure that all my children knew we would all hug, and we still do to this day. And I have no reservations about doing that. Neither do they. And they do that with their children now too. So you see, that has this kind of cascading effect.
Yes,
where it goes down from generation to generation. When you're confident in who you are, you don't have to explain anything to anybody about what you do. If it's coming from your authentic core, right? Who you are, and that kind of thing is an object lesson for your children and for the people around you. That's the modeling part of being a sensitive man, is to model those behaviors, right? So that other people can say, he hugged his son and didn't kill him. So maybe it's not a bad thing to do, right? And over time, you actually influence people by the good, loving, caring behaviors that you do.
Yeah, I love that statement you said there. When you're confident in who you are, you don't have to explain anything to anyone. I love every show gets its own quote, and I think that's your quote because that's just gold. I love it. I love that quote. But it's right. It's similar sort of thing with my son. From an early age, I think he was sensitive. I remember when he was young, very little, going to get the haircut. He was always no blow, no blow. He didn't like the hair. It was too loud. He didn't like loud noises.
Right.
And from my perspective, it wasn't, okay, I recognized he didn't like loud noises and we dealt with that. Now, did that affect his masculinity? Well, he just got a black belt in karate. I think he can handle himself.
I don't think it did.
But the same token too, when there was an issue with a bully at school and with one of his friends being bullied and he dealt with it calmly. I didn't know, he didn't tell me about it. I heard it through the teachers. And he dealt with it appropriately with the bully, with the teachers, and he was 11 when he did that. And it was that, and that's where I'm from. That I love that statement. When you're confident in who you are, you don't have to explain yourself to anybody or anything to anybody. And right. And that's what the teachers had said about him, was he just goes his own way. He's not influenced by what other people think. He's confident and goes his own way. If he doesn't like something, he just won't be part of that. And I think
that is walking in confidence, as I was describing it. All I see in my head is that Shaolin monk walking into the Western town. Everybody's running around drunk, getting, crazy and stuff. He's calm. He's the only one that's calm in the town. He's walking through it. He is not afraid. He knows that he will be fine, and he's walking with his confidence. And that's
I love that.
That to me is it in a nutshell. And you've done a great job. If you've taught your son to do that, I can just imagine what he's going to be as he grows up. He's going to be a confident, well-adjusted, and I think probably very influential man because of that. That I applaud you for that, raising him that way.
Thank you. So from that perspective, we've covered a lot of topics here. I've got pages and pages of notes. I haven't been ignoring as I've been looking down. I've been writing and taking notes while I'm listening. If we were to sum this up, how would you do that? What would you sum this up as?
Well, I think, of course, I'm looking at the question right over your head there. What is manly? And again, it goes back to the idea that we have the opportunity to redefine, reconstruct, rebuild, whatever it has to be, what masculine means for men. And I think underneath all of that, I think the one theme that we've come across is being able to have every boy grow up to be a confident, assured man, and to be able to walk his life in confidence that he is okay, who he is, exactly who he is, whether he is a sensitive person or whether he's not a sensitive person. That's not the important thing. The important thing is that he's confident in who he is. And I think with the old traditional masculinity, what it tries to do is a one size fits all. Everybody fits into this box. And if you don't fit into the box and it's not right for you, well, that's too bad. And I don't think in the 21st century, we ought to be thinking that way. And I think as human beings, we need to really examine that, because a lot of that machismo, whether it's executed by men or women, it's affecting our planet in a very negative way. And I think that's part of that, not being confident in who we are, not being able to be empathetic to other people, and to be able to recognize that we should be good stewards of the world that we live in. And I think that all comes back to people being able to be authentic in who they are. And that, to me, is really more important than are you a uber hyper masculine man, or even being a man. I like to think of it like this, and I get some flack for this, but be a human being first, right? Be a human being first. You can be a man second, whatever, but be a human being first. Use all the wonderful capabilities that humans have, even if they've been bucketed as feminine. If you're a man, or if you're a woman, masculine, use all of the things that are available to you to be a complete human being.
I love that. Be a human being first. That's awesome. I think you need 2 quotes at the start of yours. William Allen,
have at it. You can take whatever you want.
It's awesome. I love the work you do, William, in sharing, this sensitive side of being manly, which, it is part of being manly. It is important to be sensitive of what's going on around you, and whether you have more in touch with that, whether you got more midi-chlorines from taking that from the force or not, but whether you have that ability, and that's okay, and being okay with you. It's been wonderful talking with you, William. There's details in the show notes for those listening about William and his books. Feel free to reach out to him and learn more of this wonderful work that he's doing. But thank you very much for being on the show and sharing your inputs, William.
Thank you so much for having me, Damien. I really appreciate it. I really have loved this conversation tonight.
Thank you for being part of the Share.Care community and helping people around the world prosper. You're creating a bigger pie for everyone to share. The more people contributing to the world being a better place, the better the world becomes, for others and for you.